It was March 14th, 1991. Roger Tennant was 41 years old, standing in the loan office of First Midwest Bank in Holland, Iowa, holding a pen he hadn't yet decided to use. Outside the window, the parking lot was gray with leftover snow. Inside, the loan officer had already slid the papers across the desk. 600 acres. Clear title. His father's ground, paid off in 1979 after 30 years of combines and cattle and careful winters. Now Roger was about to put it all back into debt for a tractor. Not just any tractor. A New Holland 8870 Genesis. 225 horsepower, four-wheel drive. Enough pull to work ground faster than anything else in the county. The dealer said it would pay for itself in 5 years if Roger kept his acres up. The bank said they'd finance it if he refinanced the farm. His wife Karen said nothing at breakfast that morning, but her silence had weight. Roger signed. He told himself it was the smart move. Corn prices were down, but they'd come back. They always did. The old equipment was costing more to fix than it earned. Breakdowns in May meant lost days. Lost days meant late planting. Late planting meant lower yields. The 8870 would eliminate all of that. It was an investment in reliability. That's what he told Karen on the drive home. That's what he told himself when he couldn't sleep that night. The New Holland arrived on a flatbed truck 2 weeks later, gleaming blue in the morning sun, bigger than anything Roger had ever owned. His neighbor Ed Voss stood at the fence line watching it unload. Ed farmed 800 acres with equipment he'd bought used and kept running with baling wire and stubbornness. He didn't say anything, but Roger felt the judgment in the way Ed turned back toward his own shop without waving. Roger spent the first week just learning the machine. The cab was quieter than anything he'd known. The controls were smoother. The hydraulics responded before you finished the thought. It felt like farming from the future. He ran it 12 hours a day that spring, turning over black dirt that hadn't been worked this fast or this clean in decades. For a few weeks, it felt like the decision had been obvious. But corn opened at $2.30 a bushel that fall. By October, it was $2.18. Roger had budgeted for $2.70. The payment on the Genesis was $3,200 a month. The refinance had added another $1,800. $5,000 every 30 days, no matter what the market did, no matter what the weather did, no matter what broke or failed or didn't grow. Karen started working night shifts at the hospital in Sioux City. She said it was to help with health insurance. Roger knew it was to cover the months when grain checks didn't stretch far enough. She'd leave at 5:30 in the evening and come home at 7 in the morning, sleep until noon, then work the garden and the bookkeeping while Roger was in the field. They stopped eating dinner together. They stopped talking about anything that wasn't immediate. The Genesis ran flawlessly, that first year, then the second, then the third. No breakdowns, no delays. Roger planted earlier than anyone in the township and finished faster. But the market didn't care. Corn stayed low. Soybeans dropped. By 1994, Roger was looking at operating loans just to get through to harvest. He cut back on fertilizer. He cut back on seed quality. He cut back on everything except the payment. Ed Voss sold his farm in 1995. Not all of it. Just 200 acres to a neighbor who'd been wanting to expand. Ed used the money to pay off his equipment and his house. He told Roger he was tired of farming scared. Roger didn't argue. He just thought about the Genesis sitting in his shed, $30,000 left on the note, the best machine he'd ever owned, and the reason he couldn't do what Ed just did. Karen's father died that winter. Heart attack. Sudden. He left her $40,000. She put it in a separate account and told Roger it wasn't for the farm. It was for their daughter Emily's college. Emily was 14. Roger didn't fight it. He knew better. But he thought about that money every time he made a payment, every time he looked at the loan balance, every time he wondered if there was another way. The Genesis turned over 100,000 acres in 6 years. Most tractors that size would have needed an overhaul by then. The Genesis didn't. It just kept running. Roger started to resent how well it worked. If it had broken down, really broken down, expensively, unfixably, he could have justified replacing it with something smaller, something used, something that didn't cost $5,000 a month in land and iron. But it didn't break. So he kept farming. In 1998, corn hit $2 a bushel and stayed there. Roger planted every acre he had and rented another 120 from a widow 3 miles south who couldn't work it herself. He told Karen it would help. More acres meant more income. She looked at him like he'd forgotten how math worked. More acres also meant more seed, more chemical, more fuel, more risk. The Genesis could handle it. The question was whether Roger could. He hired a neighbor's son that spring to help with planting, paid him $8 an hour to run the grain cart while Roger stayed in the Genesis, pulling the 30-foot planter faster than his father ever imagined possible. They finished 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Roger felt efficient. He didn't feel safe. Emily graduated high school in 1999. She'd been accepted to Iowa State. Karen's father's money covered tuition and room for 2 years. Roger wanted to contribute. He couldn't. The farm took everything he had just to stay level. Emily never asked why. She just left in August with a used car and a savings account that wasn't connected to anything her father touched. The Genesis was 8 years old, still running like it was new. Roger had replaced the tires once, changed the oil, greased the fittings. That was it. He'd grown to hate how reliable it was. If it had needed a $10,000 transmission, he could have made a decision. He could have traded down. But you don't get rid of a machine that works. You just keep paying for it. Karen stopped working nights in 2001, not because they didn't need the money, because her back couldn't take it anymore. 12 years of overnight shifts had compressed something in her spine that physical therapy couldn't fix. She moved slower, she smiled less. She still did the books, but Roger started noticing mistakes, numbers transposed, payments scheduled wrong. He didn't say anything, he just double-checked everything and tried to fix it quietly. Corn rallied in 2003, hit $2.50 a bushel. It felt like relief. Roger paid down some operating debt and replaced a planter unit that had finally worn out. He thought about making an extra payment on the Genesis. He didn't. There was always something else, a bin that needed repair, a truck that needed tires, a fence that needed posts. The farm was like a living thing that consumed everything you fed it and still looked hungry. The Genesis hit 200,000 acres in 2004. Roger marked it in his notebook, not because it mattered, just because it felt like something should be acknowledged. 13 years, 200,000 acres, 0 breakdowns. He wondered if the machine would outlast him. He wondered if that was the point. Ed Voss came by that summer. He'd been retired for almost a decade. He looked healthy, rested. He asked Roger how things were going. Roger said fine. Ed asked if the Genesis was still running. Roger said it was. Ed nodded and said that was good. Then he got back in his truck and left. Roger stood in the driveway for a long time after that, watching dust settle on gravel, thinking about what fine actually meant. Emily got married in 2006. Roger paid for part of the reception. Not half, not what he wanted to, just what he could without pulling money from an operating loan. Karen handled the rest from her own account, money she'd saved from those night shifts years ago, money she'd never let touch the farm. Roger walked his daughter down the aisle and felt like he was borrowing time that didn't belong to him. Emily's husband was an engineer. He worked in Des Moines. They talked about grain markets at the reception like it was theory. Roger smiled and nodded and didn't say what he knew. The market crashed in 2008, not just grain, everything. Credit froze, land values dropped, operating loans got harder to justify. Roger planted anyway. The Genesis pulled the same planter across the same fields it had been working for 17 years. The machine didn't know what a recession was. It just turned dirt and burned fuel and did what it was built to do. Karen started forgetting things, little things at first, doctor's appointments, grocery lists, then bigger things, conversations they'd had the day before, Roger's birthday, Emily's phone number. Roger took her to a neurologist in Sioux Falls. The doctor used words like cognitive decline and early onset and no cure. He gave them pamphlets. He suggested planning. Roger drove home in silence, his hands tight on the wheel, thinking about payments that wouldn't stop just because his wife was disappearing. Emily called in 2009. She was pregnant. Roger said congratulations and meant it. But when she asked if he could come visit after the baby was born, he hesitated. Spring planting was unpredictable. The Genesis needed him. The ground needed him. Emily said she understood. Her voice said something different. Roger hung up and stood in the kitchen, looking at the calendar marked with planting dates and payment dates, wondering when those became the only dates that mattered. The Genesis turned 20 years old in 2011. Roger rebuilt the injector pump. Not because it failed, just because it was starting to hesitate on cold mornings. The repair cost $4,000. He could have bought a running used tractor for that. But the Genesis was still the best machine he had, still the most efficient, still the thing that let him farm 600 acres mostly alone, while Karen's memory folded in on itself. Emily had a son in 2012, Roger's first grandchild. They named him Oliver. Roger drove to Des Moines to meet him, stayed 2 hours, and drove back the same day because corn was ready and rain was coming. Emily didn't say anything, but Roger saw it in her face. The same look Karen used to give him, the look that said, "You chose this." The drought came in the summer of 2012. Not the worst Iowa had seen, but bad enough. Roger watched his corn curl and brown under a sun that wouldn't quit. He irrigated what he could, but 600 acres was too much ground for the wells he had. By August, he knew the crop was lost. Not completely, maybe 60 bushels an acre instead of the 180 he'd budgeted for. The Genesis had done its job. The ground had been worked perfectly. The seed had been placed exactly right. None of it mattered when the rain didn't come. He took out an operating loan that fall to cover the gap, $20,000 at 8% interest. The loan officer was younger than Emily. He looked at Roger's balance sheet and asked careful questions about cash flow and equity. Roger answered them all. He got the loan. He went home and parked the Genesis in the shed and didn't look at it for 3 days. Karen moved into a care facility in 2014, not full-time. Just during the day while Roger worked, she couldn't be left alone anymore. She'd wander, she'd forget the stove was on. She'd call Emily 15 times in an hour asking the same question. The facility cost $3,200 a month, the same amount as the Genesis payment had been. Roger didn't miss the symmetry. He just sold 80 acres to pay for it. 80 acres, the southeast quarter, good ground, flat, black. His father had bought it in 1967 with money saved from 10 years of hogs. Now it was gone, liquidated to cover memory care and property taxes, and a loan that still had 6 years left on a tractor Roger couldn't justify replacing. The sale netted him enough to cover 2 years of care. After that, he'd have to sell more. The buyer was a young farmer named Travis Kemp, 28 years old, aggressive. He farmed 1,200 acres and wanted more. He walked the ground with Roger before closing, talking about yield potential and drainage improvements. Roger listened and nodded and didn't say that this field had grown his daughter's college fund and his father's retirement and 30 years of decent crops without needing improvement. Travis wouldn't have understood. He was farming for growth. Roger had been farming for survival. They weren't the same thing. The Genesis was still running. 23 years old, 250,000 acres. Roger had replaced the clutch, rebuilt the hydraulics. The cab interior was worn, the paint was faded, but it started every morning and pulled every implement he hooked to it. He thought about the loan officer in 1991, sliding those papers across the desk, promising 5 years to pay off. Roger had been paying for 23. He started thinking about retirement in 2015. Not seriously, just the way you think about distant weather. Emily mentioned it on the phone one night, said he'd earned it, said he could sell the farm, move closer to them, see Oliver grow up. Roger said maybe. He didn't mean it. The Genesis was still good, the ground still needed working. What else would he do? He sold another 120 acres in 2016, the northwest corner. Wet ground, not his best. But it was what Travis Kemp wanted, and Roger couldn't afford to be picky. The sale covered another 3 years of care and paid off the Genesis. Finally. After 25 years, the tractor was his, free and clear. He didn't feel relief. He just felt tired. Karen stopped recognizing him in 2017. She'd smile when he visited, she'd hold his hand, but she'd ask the nurse who he was after he left. The nurse told Roger it was normal, progressive, expected. Roger sat in his truck in the parking lot after one visit and tried to remember the last real conversation they'd had. Not just words, real conversation, where she knew him and he knew her, and they were still the people who'd started this together. He couldn't remember. It had been years. Emily came home for Thanksgiving that year. She sat with her mother for an hour, then found Roger in the machine shed, staring at the Genesis. She asked if he regretted it. Roger didn't ask what she meant. He just said he didn't know anymore. Emily was quiet for a long time. Then she said Mom worked nights for 12 years because of this tractor. Roger said he knew. Emily said, "Do you?" Roger didn't answer. Emily went back inside. The Genesis failed in the spring of 2018. Not catastrophically, just a seized bearing in the transmission. Repairable. $3,500. Roger had it fixed. He could have traded it in, could have bought something newer, smaller, more efficient, but he'd already paid for this machine 3 times over in money and time and things that didn't have price tags. He wasn't going to quit on it now. He planted 400 acres that spring. He'd stopped renting the widow's ground 2 years earlier. She'd died and her kids sold it to Travis Kemp, who now farmed over 2,000 acres with equipment Roger couldn't afford to look at. Travis waved when they passed each other on the road. Roger waved back. They didn't stop to talk. There wasn't anything to say. He sold the last 160 acres that fall. Kept 240. Enough to justify running the Genesis. Not enough to call it a farm anymore. The buyer was a corporate operation out of Nebraska. They paid cash. They didn't ask questions. They didn't walk the ground. Roger deposited the check and paid off the operating loan and the property tax and set aside money for Karen's care. What was left went into an account Emily would inherit someday. Along with 240 acres and a New Holland 8870 Genesis with 300,000 acres on the engine. Karen died in January 2019, quietly, in her sleep. The nurse called at 4 a.m. Roger dressed in the dark and drove to the facility and sat with her body for an hour before they took her away. She looked peaceful. She looked like someone he used to know. He tried to remember her voice, the way she laughed, the way she used to wait up for him during harvest, coffee on, radio low, just to make sure he made it home. He couldn't quite get there. The memories were distant, like something that happened to other people. The funeral was small. Roger sat in the front row and listened to a pastor who'd never met his wife talk about grace and memory and rest. Emily sat beside him, holding his hand the way she used to when she was small. After the service, she asked what he was going to do. Roger said he didn't know. He still had 240 acres to plant. Emily said, "Dad, just that, just his name." Roger looked at her and saw Karen. Saw the same question he'd been avoiding for 28 years. He said, "I know." Emily squeezed his hand. They didn't talk about it again. The Genesis sat in the shed that winter, hibernating under dust and stillness. Roger walked out there sometimes, late at night when the house felt too big and too quiet. He'd stand beside the machine and rest his hand on the hood, still cold from months without running. 28 years. That's how long it had taken for the consequences to finish rolling out. The farm was a third of what it had been. Karen was gone. Emily lived 3 hours away with a family that didn't need anything from him except the occasional visit he was usually too busy to make. But the Genesis was still there, paid for, functional, ready to plant another season if Roger asked it to. He thought about the day he signed those papers, the loan officer, the confidence, the belief that 5 years of efficiency would erase 30 years of debt. He thought about Ed Voss, retired and rested, 10 years gone from farming and still alive to see his grandchildren whenever he wanted. He thought about Karen, working nights for 12 years to cover a decision she'd never agreed to, then disappearing into a disease that took her piece by piece while Roger worked ground. The Genesis had never lied to him. It did exactly what it was built to do. It worked ground. It planted crops. It ran 3 decades without breaking his trust. But trust wasn't the same as wisdom, and reliability wasn't the same as rightness. He called Emily in February, asked if he could come visit. She sounded surprised, then pleased. She said, of course, anytime. Roger drove down the following Saturday, spent the whole day, met Oliver's teachers, watched him play soccer, sat at Emily's table and ate dinner with her family like he was part of something that wasn't measured in acres or payments. Emily walked him to his truck that evening. She said, "You should do this more." Roger said, "I will." He meant it this time. Roger fired up the Genesis in late March. The engine caught on the first try, rumbling low and steady, filling the shed with the smell of diesel and resolve. He pulled it out into the pale spring light, hooked up the planter, and started working the 240 acres he had left. The machine moved across the field exactly the way it had in 1991. Smooth, powerful, indifferent to everything except the work. He finished planting in 4 days. It used to take 2 weeks with the old equipment. That efficiency had cost him 460 acres, a marriage that ended in a memory care room, and a daughter who called twice a month out of duty instead of desire. But the work was done. The ground was planted. The Genesis was still running. Roger parked the tractor in the shed and walked back to the house. The sun was setting behind him, casting long shadows across fields that used to stretch farther than he could see. Now they stopped at fence lines that hadn't been there a decade ago. He thought about calling Emily. He didn't need to. They'd already made plans for the weekend. That was different. That was new. Inside, the kitchen was clean and silent. No coffee brewing, no radio murmuring low in the background. No Karen at the table with the books spread out, asking quiet questions about cash flow and timing. Just Roger, and the knowledge that the farm had survived. Smaller, lonelier, but still here. He made a pot of coffee and sat at the table, looking out the window toward the shed where the Genesis waited for the next season. The machine had outlasted almost everything. The marriage, the debt, the neighbors who'd sold out or retired or died. It sat there in the dark, 28 years old, ready to work whenever he asked. Roger wondered if that was enough. If survival without context was still success. If holding on to production while losing everything else was the kind of farming his father would have respected. He didn't know. He'd never know. The decision had been made in 1991, and the consequences had taken 28 years to finish counting themselves. But the Genesis was still there, and so was Roger, and in the morning, the ground would still need work. That was the only certainty left. Except now there was something else. A grandson who played soccer, a daughter who wanted him around, a life that existed in the spaces between planting and harvest, if he chose to look for it. Travis Kemp stopped by in early May. He was looking to expand again, asked if Roger had thought about selling the rest. Roger said maybe. Not this year, but maybe soon. Travis nodded, said to let him know. He drove off in a truck that cost more than Roger's first 2 tractors combined. Roger watched him go and didn't feel anything except tired. He walked back to the shed. The Genesis sat quiet in the shadows. He ran his hand along the fender, feeling the dents and scratches from 3 decades of work. The machine had given him everything it promised: reliability, efficiency, power. It wasn't the Genesis's fault that those things hadn't been enough. That farming 600 acres perfectly didn't mean the same thing as living well. That you could do everything right with the ground and still lose what mattered. Roger locked the shed and walked back to the house. He had 240 acres left. A grandchild he barely knew. A daughter who'd forgiven him, even though he hadn't forgiven himself. And a New Holland 8870 Genesis that would run until the day he decided to stop asking it to. The farm had survived. That was the truth. What it had survived as, that was the question Roger would carry until the ground finally took him to. But for the first time in 28 years, he thought maybe survival wasn't the only question worth asking. Maybe there were other ways to measure a life, other things worth working for. The Genesis couldn't tell him that. The ground couldn't tell him that. Only time could. And Roger, at 69 years old, was finally willing to listen. He finished his coffee in the quiet house and went to bed. Outside, the New Holland 8870 Genesis sat cold and still in the machine shed, a monument to reliability and cost, waiting for spring to ask something of it again.